The wind sliced through the London night like a blade, carrying with it a bitter chill that made even the street lamps flicker. Beneath one of them, at a nearly abandoned bus stop on the outskirts of the city, stood a man whose entire world had narrowed to the thin folder clutched tightly in his hands. Edward Barnes, once a structural engineer, now stood in worn boots with holes in the soles and a jacket that had seen far better years. Inside the manila folder were the last 5 copies of his CV, each one returned with polite rejections or no reply at all. At 46, he wasn't just unemployed. He was invisible. His cheeks were raw from the cold, his breath rising in pale puffs. Behind his tired eyes lay a world of grief. He was a widower, a father clinging to the hope of reuniting with the son social services had taken away when the shelter deemed their truck home too unstable. Edward didn't complain. He just endured, worked odd jobs when they came, studied building codes in the local library, and kept his appearance as neat as possible. "My boy needs to believe things can get better," he once told a caseworker, "and for that I've got to look like I believe it too." That night, as snowflakes swirled in gusts and the bus remained stubbornly late, a woman appeared, startling in her contrast to the bleakness. She looked about 35, dressed sharply in a tailored blouse and skirt with no coat, hair damp from the sleet, arms hugged tightly around herself. Her heels clicked like defiance against the wet pavement as she stepped beneath the same awning. Edward noticed her shivering, saw the way she rubbed her hands together in futility. For a moment he looked away. She didn't belong here. But then the wind picked up again and she flinched as if struck. Without a word, he unbuttoned his only coat. It wasn't much, frayed at the cuffs and barely thick enough for the season, but it was something. Quietly, he stepped forward and held it out to her. She blinked, startled. "You don't have to," she began. "I've already lost everything," Edward said softly, his voice tired but kind. "This is the one thing I've got left to give." He gently draped it over her shoulders. She hesitated, but then drew it tighter, inhaling its warmth like memory. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded, folding his arms against the cold and looking out over the snow-covered street. Neither of them knew it then, but that one small act of kindness, born from nothing but quiet decency, was about to change both their lives forever. By the time Edward returned to the old Vauxhall parked behind a shuttered warehouse in East London, his hands were numb and his limbs stiff with cold. The wind had picked up, sweeping snow in tight spirals around the building, but he barely noticed anymore. This was his reality now. The back seat had been turned into a makeshift bed, layers of blankets, a pillow flattened with use, and a dented lunchbox tucked beneath a pile of worn clothes. He climbed into the car slowly, shutting the door with a soft groan as it creaked against the frost. Silence settled over him like another heavy coat. From the glove compartment, he retrieved a small tin and opened it. Inside was a photograph, faded but still vibrant in meaning. His wife Margaret smiling in the garden, and their boy Jamie, no more than 7, with a missing front tooth and a crooked grin. Edward whispered, "Good night, love. Good night, Jamie." His voice cracked with exhaustion and memory. Once he'd had a proper home. He built schools, repaired bridges, laid foundations that would stand for decades. Margaret had been a primary school teacher, full of warmth and wit. Their life had been modest but full of love. Then cancer came fast and merciless. She was gone within months. Everything after that, his job, savings, the house, crumbled under the weight of grief. Edward had done his best to shield Jamie from the spiral, telling bedtime stories from the front seat of the car, turning canned beans into pirate treasure and hiding the cold behind pretend adventures. But eventually someone noticed. A school social worker flagged the living situation. They said Jamie needed stability. Edward, already beaten down by the world, didn't fight. He signed the papers with trembling hands and told his son, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a step forward through mud. He'd queue at job centers, attend workshops, scribble notes from library textbooks, and never once allowed his beard to grow wild or his shirt to wrinkle. He needed to look like a man who still believed in tomorrow, even if he wasn't sure he did. That's why, when he gave away his jacket to the stranger at the bus stop, he wasn't trying to be noble. He wasn't trying to be seen. He just couldn't bear to stand in the cold while someone else suffered, especially not someone who reminded him, even just a little, of Margaret. The woman's name was Sarah. and she had accepted his coat like it meant more than cloth. Her hands had trembled. Her eyes had flickered with something between disbelief and relief. She'd offered him a card. Edward tucked it away, not expecting anything. He'd heard similar promises before, hollow kindnesses from people too uncomfortable to do nothing but too distant to truly help. But something about Sarah lingered in his mind as he drifted to sleep that night beneath 3 blankets and one memory of warmth. He didn't know it yet, but that night had cracked open a door, one that he thought the world had long since bolted shut. The next morning, Sarah Morgan sat in the silence of her penthouse flat, sunlight struggling to warm the marble floors and glass walls that overlooked the frozen skyline of London. The coat, a threadbare olive green thing, still hung limply over the back of her velvet armchair, too big for her but oddly grounding. She had meant to return it, had told herself it wasn't right to keep it. But now, hours later, she found herself reaching for it again. It still held the faint scent of soap, maybe coffee, or perhaps just the kind of quiet resilience she'd almost forgotten existed. She pulled the coat close, her fingers brushing against something in the inside pocket. Curious, she reached in and retrieved a folded piece of paper. It was smudged, creased, worn by time and hands that had likely held it every day. Unfolding it slowly, her breath caught in her throat. A child's drawing. Crayon figures, one tall, one small, under a crooked yellow sun. The larger figure was labeled Dad, the smaller, Me. Between them, a wobbly red heart. At the bottom, scrawled in innocent, unsteady handwriting, I lo. Sarah stared at the page, her chest tightening. The man, Edward, had said almost nothing the night before, just a tired smile, a quiet strength, and a coat he couldn't afford to give. She had assumed he was just another man beaten down by life, but now, holding this crayon drawing, she realized he was something else entirely. A father, a man still carrying love in his pocket even after the world had stripped him of every... She sank into the armchair, coat still wrapped around her, drawing in hand. Her flat was immaculate. Designer furnishings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a kitchen she rarely cooked in. She had built infinity tech from scratch, launched out of a garage in Manchester and scaled into one of the UK's fastest-growing tech firms. She'd climbed every ladder, crushed every goal. But now, in the quiet of this sterile, spotless space, she felt emptier than she'd ever been. And then, without warning, tears welled up. Not the sharp, frustrated kind that she'd grown used to pushing down, but soft, aching tears she hadn't cried since she was a child herself. Her mind flashed back to a night long ago, a younger version of her, coatless and cold, sitting on the stone steps of St. Mark's Church in Sheffield. She'd been no older than 10, waiting for morning. Then a man had appeared. Wrinkled coat, kind eyes. He didn't ask questions. He just took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. You'll be all right, love. Sarah looked again at the drawing and whispered, Jamie. Then she folded the picture gently and placed it on her lap, clutching the coat tighter. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerful or polished or in control. She just felt human. And suddenly she knew. She had to find him, not to return the coat, not even to say thank you, but because in that freezing moment, that evening, as the frost crept up the windows of the sleek boardroom on the 37th floor of Infinity Tech, Sarah Morgan sat at the long glass table, her thoughts far removed from earnings reports and quarterly projections. In her hand, she held the worn crayon drawing folded neatly into a square, now a permanent fixture in her handbag. Her executives were talking, pitching numbers, growth strategies, talent acquisitions. She nodded politely, occasionally scribbling notes. But inside, something had shifted, something irreversible. She couldn't stop thinking about Edward, the man from the bus stop. His name, his face, his quiet dignity as he stood shivering without his coat, offering warmth without hesitation, had rooted itself deep inside her. Later that night, she sat alone in her office, the city's skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She pulled the coat from where she'd placed it, draped over the back of a visitor's chair. As she held it in her lap, she whispered aloud, Edward, who are you? She reached into her drawer, pressed the small silver service bell, and within moments her assistant Rachel appeared. Yes, Miss Morgan? Sarah didn't look up. I need you to help me find someone. Rachel blinked, surprised. Of course, who? Sarah turned the drawing over gently on the desk. His name is Edward, I don't have a surname. He was at the 17 bus stop outside Camden Library 2 nights ago. Around 8:30, he gave me his coat. Rachel hesitated. We don't usually track people down like that. Sarah finally met her gaze. I know, but I need to do this quietly. Just find him. Over the next 2 days, her normally tight-lipped staff became a discreet search party. Traffic footage was pulled, bus records requested, local shelters and community kitchens contacted. Every CCTV clip, every blurred shadow, every jacket was studied. Finally, they had a lead. A faded construction license, a name, Edward Barnes, once a structural engineer, widower, no fixed address, seen sleeping in the back of a rusted Vauxhall parked behind a derelict warehouse in Tottenham. The next morning, Sarah found herself in the back of a black Mercedes, being driven far from the glimmering towers of the financial district, past shuttered shops, estate blocks, graffiti-covered walls. The car stopped at the edge of an empty industrial lot. Snow lay thick on the ground. There, tucked against the brick wall, sat the battered Vauxhall. A man was inside, barely visible through the fogged-up windows. Sarah stepped out into the cold. Her heels crunched against gravel. The wind bit at her cheeks. As she neared the car, the door opened slowly, and Edward emerged, disheveled, surprised, but instantly recognizable. You, he murmured, blinking against the daylight. Sarah, she said softly. I came to find you. He frowned. Why? Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, about what you did, about what it meant. He looked down, rubbing his hands together for warmth. You didn't have to do this. A thank you would have been enough. She stepped closer. It's not about thanks. It's about not letting kindness go unseen. You gave me something real that night, and I want to return the gesture if you'll let me. Edward shifted uneasily. I'm just a bloke trying to get through the day, that's all. Sarah reached into her handbag and handed him a thick envelope. This isn't charity, it's opportunity, a job interview, something real. I've made a place for you, if you want it. If not, walk away, no pressure. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least offer. He stared at the envelope, the weight of a lifetime of letdowns clear in his eyes. Why me? He whispered. Because, she said gently, you reminded me who I used to be. The cold wind stirred between them, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt warm again. So did he. A week had passed since Sarah Morgan had shown up at Edward Barnes's rusted Vauxhall in that forgotten corner of Tottenham, and yet every hour since had felt like a dream to Edward, fragile, surreal, and in danger of vanishing with the morning light. He now found himself walking through the towering glass doors of Infinity Tech, not as a guest or a janitor, but as someone expected, a newly appointed advisor. No press, no fanfare, just quiet acknowledgement and one handwritten sign on a door. Edward Barnes, Human Values Consultant. At first, he felt like an imposter. His boots still had traces of construction dust, and his coat, though clean, carried a fray or two. He didn't talk like the others, didn't use fancy terms or pitch buzzwords in meetings, but when he spoke, the room fell silent. Not because he demanded attention, but because his words carried something rare: truth. He talked about what it meant to be invisible, about the dignity of labor, the weight of grief, and the kindness that costs more when you've nothing left to give. One day, a junior analyst knocked on his door just before lunch. She looked barely out of university, her hands trembling as she held a coffee cup. I heard what you said in the meeting, about how some people are carrying silent battles. Edward nodded. She looked at him, eyes brimming. My dad died last year. I haven't been the same since, but no one here ever noticed. Until today. Edward didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just gestured to the chair beside him and said, You don't have to carry it alone. Word spread. Employees who never stayed past 5 p.m. began lingering outside his office. People began greeting each other more, listening more, laughing more. A kind of quiet revolution stirred in the building, not driven by spreadsheets or profit margins, but by the human heart. Even Sarah, usually composed and untouchable in her corner office, found herself drawn to these moments. She'd often linger by the doorway, listening to Edward speak about resilience without ever using the word. watching as something softened in the air around him, as though his very presence granted permission to feel again. And slowly, something changed in Sarah, too. One afternoon, after a long meeting, she found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, at a story Edward told about turning the backseat of his old car into a space shuttle for his son. "I had to improvise," he grinned. "Tinfoil, a flashlight, and a cereal box. Best mission to Mars ever launched from a Tesco car park." By then, Edward had moved out of his car and into a modest flat in East London, one with heat, a kettle, and a room ready for Noah, who would be visiting during school holidays. The first time Noah stepped into the flat, he ran straight to the tiny bookshelf lined with second-hand paperbacks and whispered, "Dad, you really did it." And Edward just pulled him close, heart aching with the weight of a promise kept. He hadn't saved the world. He hadn't invented the next tech breakthrough, but he had done something bigger, quieter. He'd reminded an empire of glass and metal that it had a soul. And every day he did it not through speeches, but by listening, by remembering names, by showing up with a cup of tea and asking, "How are you really?" From a single act of kindness at a bus stop, a whole movement had begun. One coat, one gesture, and now a life rebuilt. Not only his, but Sarah's and many others who had almost forgotten what compassion looked like. Under the warm glow of fairy lights strung across the modest courtyard of Thomas's place, laughter drifted through the air like music, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of children's bare feet skipping across stone tiles. The wedding wasn't grand. There were no marble staircases or Michelin-starred chefs, but it didn't need to be. Every corner of the little red brick community center was filled with heart. Paper flowers made by the kids fluttered on the walls, mismatched chairs lined up neatly by volunteers, and a simple sponge cake baked by a young intern took pride of place on a folding table near the front. Edward Barnes stood beneath a handmade arch wrapped in ivy and cloth, wearing the same suit he had borrowed for his first day at Infinity Tech. It was a bit snug at the shoulders now, but pressed neatly and worn with quiet pride. Beside him stood his son Noah, taller now, his teenage grin a little more confident, acting as best man with a crooked tie and eyes that glistened with joy. Then came Sarah Morgan. She wasn't draped in diamonds or designer satin. Instead, she wore a soft, flowing white dress that brushed her ankles and let her hair fall loose around her shoulders. As she walked down the aisle holding a bouquet of wildflowers picked from a park that morning, every guest turned, not in awe of her wealth or status, but in reverence of something far rarer, vulnerability wrapped in strength. She walked not like a CEO, but like a woman who had found her home. They stood before their loved ones, volunteers, shelter workers, colleagues who had once been strangers but were now family, and looked into each other's eyes. Sarah took Edward's hands and said, "Once you gave me your coat on a freezing night. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. You simply gave what you had. Tonight I give you everything I am, my life, my heart, my promise that you will never walk cold or alone again." Edward's voice caught in his throat. All he could do was nod, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. In the background, someone played a gentle tune on an old piano. The children clapped, and Noah wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his too-big blazer. There were no luxury cars, no five-tier cakes, no paparazzi waiting outside. But when the sun began to set behind the old rooftop of Thomas's place, someone captured a photo. Sarah resting her head on Edward's shoulder, his arm wrapped gently around her waist, and beside them, framed on an easel, the old worn jacket that had started it all, frayed, faded, but now a symbol of everything beautiful they'd built from one small act of kindness. It would be shared online thousands of times, not because it was glamorous, but because it reminded people everywhere that love doesn't need chandeliers or champagne. Sometimes all it needs is a coat, a heart open to give, and someone willing to see the good in a stranger. On the polished marble stage of Infinity Group's towering glass atrium, a gentle hush settled over the gathered crowd. Employees, junior developers, senior managers, receptionists, interns, stood shoulder to shoulder, not in anticipation of a product launch or quarterly report, but something far more human. Soft white drapes framed the space, and golden fairy lights wove through beams above their heads. At the center of it all, Claire Morgan, CEO and co-founder, stepped up to the microphone. She wasn't in a power suit or speaking in jargon today. She wore a simple navy dress and held a small, worn coat in her hands. "This isn't a day about profits or projections," she began, her voice calm but full of quiet emotion. "This is about moments." She paused, eyes scanning the room, her gaze landing for a beat on the man standing near the back, Edward Barnes. His frame was broad, his hands still rough from years of work, but today he stood straighter, his suit pressed, and his eyes, once guarded, were open, vulnerable, watching her. Claire continued, "1 year ago, I was standing at a bus stop, freezing, alone, and more lost than I realized. A man, whom I had never met, gave me his coat. He didn't ask who I was or where I was going. He simply gave. That one act didn't just change my night. It changed the course of everything that came after." She stepped aside and pulled a cloth from the easel next to her. Framed behind glass was the very same coat, olive green, fraying at the seams, sleeves too long for her arms but heavy with meaning. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." There were murmurs of emotion from the crowd. Some wiped tears, others clasped their hands tightly, but all eyes turned to Edward as Claire extended a hand toward him. "Edward, will you come up here?" As he made his way forward, the applause began, slow, respectful, then rising into a wave that filled the vast atrium. He stepped beside Claire, unsure of what to say, when she reached into her pocket and pressed a sealed envelope into his hand. "This belongs to you," she said simply. Inside was the deed to the house he and his son now called home. A new beginning, a safe place. No more sleeping in trucks, no more waiting at cold bus stops with nothing but hope. Edward looked up, stunned, emotion rising in his chest. But before he could speak, he reached into his own pocket, pulled out a small box and dropped to one knee. "I gave you my coat," he said, voice trembling, "but you gave me back my life. Sarah Morgan, will you marry me?" The crowd gasped. Claire froze for half a second, then laughed through her tears and nodded. "Yes, yes, of course I will." And just like that, the story of a jacket became a legacy, a symbol of how the simplest kindness can reach across worlds, melt walls, and plant the seed of something extraordinary. Their wedding wasn't held in a grand ballroom or a luxury resort. It took place at Thomas's place, the little red brick community center that had once sheltered a cold and frightened little girl. Children ran barefoot across the courtyard, laughter echoing through the halls. Handmade paper flowers swayed in the breeze, and the cake, baked by a young intern from Edward's mentorship program, was lopsided but perfect. Claire wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, her face radiant. Edward stood in the same suit he had once worn to an interview he never imagined landing. Noah, his son, served as best man, his proud grin never fading. The room was filled with people who had once felt invisible, volunteers, shelter workers, struggling students, each of them witnesses to a story that had rewritten what it meant to be seen and loved. When Claire took Edward's hands, she said, "Once you gave me a coat. Tonight I give you my whole life." And in that moment, surrounded by fairy lights and faces shining with tears, they reminded everyone that the smallest act of compassion can lead to the most extraordinary ending. Life lesson. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the humblest moments. A coat offered in silence, a smile shared in the cold. Never underestimate the power of kindness. You never know when your small gesture might become someone else's turning point or even the beginning of a lifelong love. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear how kindness has shaped your journey. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales that inspire hope, heal wounds, and remind us what truly matters in life. Let's spread compassion, one story at a time.